Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I am a member of Plymouth Congregational Church. Some say this is the most important election for Minneapolis in decades. If so, it's in large part because of 3 amendments that are on the ballot for the November 2nd election. Plymouth's Reimagining Community Safety Committee of its Racial Justice Initiative is hosting 3 Zoom discussions to explore these 3 ballot measures before the voters. And the first conversation is tonight on an amendment regarding rent stabilization. And so I'm pleased to announce our moderator and 2 speakers who will engage in a interesting, lively, and inspiring conversation. First, our moderator is Solomon Gustavo, who is a MinnPost Metro reporter. Prior to joining MinnPost, he was a reporter at the Orlando Weekly, where he covered everything from local government and law enforcement to shark sightings. Before heading south, Gustavo wrote for the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder and Lilly Suburban newspapers. The St. Paul native has also contributed to City Pages, the Daily Beast, and Sahan Journal. I'm also pleased to introduce Jennifer Arnold. She is the co-director of Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or United Renters for Justice. In 2014, organizers and volunteers from the Lindale Neighborhood Association, including Jennifer, convened a group of 20 Latinx renters in a small church in the Lindale neighborhood to discuss their housing problems. Renters spent hours sharing daily abuses in which their landlords and management companies were inflicting. And in the end, they decided they needed and deserved more. From those beginnings, Inquilinos was born, and tenant members decided to elect Jennifer as a co-director in 2015. The organization has now racked up very many hard-fought wins, and their efforts were featured in a New York Times article in 2020 titled "The Tenants Who Evicted Their Landlord." Finally, we are also pleased to welcome Sissel Smith, who's the president and CEO of the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, and he is also principal and managing broker of Cornerstone Properties. So the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association is a member organization that promotes high standards in the development, management, and maintenance of rental and owner-occupied multifamily housing. Its members include the state's largest apartment managers and developers, but also many who manage fewer than 20 units each. They engage in robust activities to support members, such as trainings and advocacy activities at the state and local levels. And Cecil is a native of New Zealand. And so I'm turning it over now to Solomon.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone, for having us. The issue of rent control on the ballot, we were just discussing earlier with the 2 panelists, is something we feel is a bit under-discussed, even with everything going on this election cycle. So happy to be here tonight. Rent control, for a quick definition to start off, is something that, given all the examples and iterations across the country, can be, can vary wildly. Here the ballot questions are such that they would give the city the power to enact a certain policy, but no policies is on the plate right now. It's just questions that ask whether or not residents would like the city council or residents, those 2 lanes, either to have the power to enact rent control, and voting in favor is what appeases the loophole in state law that bars all Minnesota cities from enacting rent control. So there's some table setting there. I'll start with Jennifer and ask you firstly to describe, in your eyes and the view of your organization, the state of the problem. How bad is the situation with rent and the housing market and rentals in the housing market right now?
You know, I think it depends on who you ask. The folks who are dealing with the worst situation in the housing market are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who are experiencing rent increases in this decade more than, or in the 2010s more than previously. And these increases are displacing entire communities. In 2017, Cura at the University of Minnesota put out a report naming that there were no neighborhoods in Minneapolis that were affordable for Black families, and 3 neighborhoods that were affordable for Latino families. And that was in 2017. And in our organization, we have seen that with our own eyes. Like Elizabeth was talking about, we started organizing in the Lyndale neighborhood in 2014. And at that time, there were 8 buildings sort of between Lake and Lyndale, Lake and 31st, Pleasant and Pillsbury, that I was getting to know renters in, and I still know the people who live there. And in 2014, those buildings were entirely Latino, and now they're about 25%. The families, 25% of the families are left that were there. And now it's primarily younger white people who have moved into those buildings. And the Latino renters that lived there have moved to Richfield or Bloomington. And so this kind of displacement we are seeing across the city, we're experiencing it. And it's really important to name that it's impacting, this is a racial justice issue. The rent increases are, the Cura report that was commissioned last year by the City Council found that the rent increases since the Great Recession have impacted the most affordable quarter of the housing market. So the rents that were the most affordable, the 25%. And folks living in those buildings are primarily Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So that's where the push is in the most affordable units. And what that means is that puts tremendous strain on the community that's experiencing those rent increases. So we know that now Minneapolis is a majority renter city. We are a 51% renter city. And that over half of the tenants living in the city are cost burdened, which means that over half of the tenants living in the city pay more than 30% of their income on rent. And half of those tenants pay more than 50% of their income on rent. So the problem when the rent keeps increasing is that it's not a good in the market like any other good. You can't choose to go somewhere else just because your rent is going up. So families double up, families find another job. I was making phone calls this week and talked to somebody who said, yeah, I don't know what's gonna happen every month because I'm working many jobs to pay the rent and I don't know what happens when it goes up again. And so this is really the problem that we're addressing, is the increasing pressure on the cost of rent. And I want to name that one of the big contributors to this is outside money coming into our city and buying up housing. One of the groups of renters that we are working with rent from Havenbrook Homes. And Havenbrook Homes is the second largest single-family homeowner in the country. It's a company called Pretium Partners, and they own 50,000 single-family homes across the country, and are increasing rents for the tenants that we speak to every few months or every 6 months on families living in the north side of Minneapolis. And so I just want to start by saying that this is a racial justice issue. And rent stabilization is about saying, hold up. We need to put common sense protections in place to make sure that our community can stay where they live.
Is rent control seen as the most immediate avenue for solving some of the housing issues you described? I mean, perhaps because it is barred by the state, is seen as an extra measure. Were there other things that your organization saw as other things to try and you kind of landed on rent control, or is that the most direct route? How would you explain kind of picking rent control as an
Yeah.
option to solve some of these things?
I love that question. You know that rent stabilization is so much in people's guts that since the beginning of our organization, I can't tell you how many renters have called to say, hey, my rent's going up $300. How is that legal? Is this legal? Right? Rent stabilization is like minimum wage. People expect it to already be there because it feels so violating to have your rent go up that amount. And so for our membership, since 2014, this has always been the top priority. Great, let's talk about other policies, but what I really care about is how expensive the rent is and what is going to happen next year. That's always been the case for our membership. And so for us organizationally, we've always had our sights on rent stabilization because there are other policies that we can do to address the affordable housing crisis, and frankly, we should. But rent stabilization is the most universal, immediate, cost-effective to implement that impacts everybody, right? With a policy like this, we can keep people in their homes. And all the studies agree that what rent stabilization does best is keep people in their homes, keep communities stable. And so for us, it's because it's in the interest of our membership, because it is it's so common sense to people. And think about it, if you have a mortgage, you can count on your mortgage every year. Your taxes will go up, but that is negligible compared to what people see in rent increases. And so just the fact that every year living in an apartment, you never know what's going to happen next year. You don't know if you're going to have to move. I am recently a homeowner, but before I've lived all over town. And it was about rent. It was where can I find a place to live? And I have a college education, and I'm a white person. And so for us, this measure is common sense. It is basic, and it is a cornerstone for other policies that we can enact to address the housing crisis that we are in, that frankly is getting worse as we speak. The pandemic has impacted our communities in really serious ways and continues to.
In your fight to transition the city into one that can enact rent control, are you at a stage now, you and your organization, that you feel the city should be in a place of just kind of discussing whether or not this is a basic thing, and that the city, through one avenue or another, and we'll get into the weeds on that later on, should have the ability to do this? Or do you have specific policy in mind?
Yeah, we think we should discuss it, but we believe that the policy that is on the ballot in St. Paul is a very reasonable policy that we would propose for Minneapolis as well. And to be clear, that policy allows for a 3% rent increase every year. So landlords are allowed to raise the rent 3%. And it has no carve-outs, which means there's no vacancy decontrol. Some other places, as soon as somebody moves out of a unit, the landlord is allowed to raise the rent any amount that they want. We would prefer that there's no vacancy decontrol, because that puts pressure on, sometimes you see situations where landlords will put pressure on tenants to move so that they can do that. We also believe it should be universal. It should be for single-family homes and multifamily units. And for us, that's because the north side is filled with single-family homes. And if we don't enact something that is universal that way, we'll leave out a large amount of our Black population. And again, this is a racial equity issue. And the housing system was built on the backs of discrimination of Black folks and Indigenous people, beginning with the theft of land, and then going to racial housing covenants and redlining and mortgages. And so we believe that it should be universal, and that it should apply to all housing after it is built.
A columnist for MinPost wrote a piece in which he did some research, looked up a bunch of different kinds of rent control policy. I'm sure you're familiar with this piece. And personally came to the conclusion that because there would be no carve-outs or exceptions kind of written into the policy for the 3% plan over in St. Paul, it would make it perhaps the strictest rent control measure in the country, perhaps the world. The St. Paul measure also has a bit of a backdoor. The organizers there say they would like to have a committee in place that would field requests for specific exceptions, applied by specific individual proprietors. Do you have an idea of certain exceptions that, in your research and in talking to people in the market, that sound like, that might be one that we acknowledge is one that will likely come with an exception here and there from the committee? So firstly, is that something that on the Minneapolis side, would you also want a kind of body like that? Or how would you let me even back it up further and say, how would you even like to field those sorts of applications? And then how would you see that playing out?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to have a committee that can oversee requests for variations on that. And I can imagine situations that would require a variation from the 3% cap. I would want to see the books, right? So Inquilinos Unidos has been organizing renters for 6 years, and when we organize all the renters who rent from the same landlord, and then we say, basically, it's when folks are really struggling to get repairs. And we bring everybody together and we go to the landlord and say, here are the repairs needed. Can we get these things fixed? And it's only through court actions that we've been able to see things like profit margins, right? These are not things that are open to the public that people know about. And so I'd want to see the books. Let's see what's actually happening. And to be super clear, when we had a very public court case against Steve Friends in the apartment shop, we found that his profit margins were 70%, which is wild and comes at direct cost of the folks living in the buildings, both in terms of rents that they're paying and conditions that they're putting up with, because there's a lack of money being reinvested in those buildings. And so I would say, yes, I think exceptions make sense, and they should come at, let's see your books. What's happening? I can see situations where landlords need to do remodeling or things like that, in the naturally occurring affordable housing. I'm going to put quotes on it because I think that term should be explored. There's reason, I know from experience that to get a lot of those buildings up to code, the investments required are quite large. And so I think those are the situations that would make sense to me to have exceptions if needed.
The St. Paul group landed on 3%. You said you agree with that number for the cap. Why do you agree? Why 3%?
Yeah, I would say 2 reasons. One, for me, it's largely based off of the research that Cura did last year on a rent stabilization policy with the city of Minneapolis. And one of the big research, one of the things that they did is they pulled data on the rent increases in the last 20 years. What do they look like? When have they happened? Where and why? And they found that most rent increases were below 3%. And that there were just very small outliers. A small percentage of the total, there were outliers of 8 or 9% rent increases. And so the 3% is really about leaving space so that landlords can raise the rent, and perhaps knowing that there is that cap. More landlords will choose to raise rents every year, but there is that limit of how much can be increased. And the second thing I would say is, I know there's an argument about why not tie it to CPI, the consumer, CPI? Yes, the Consumer Price Index, thank you. But, when you look at the Consumer Price Index, you can pull it apart and see what is it that they're basing that number on. They're looking at a bunch of items in the market and the increasing costs of them. But in rental housing, generally you have a mortgage, and that is steady. That stays the same. That doesn't increase with the CPI. And so 3% is really, it's a reasonable amount. It's based on historical precedent. And it allows landlords to be able to make their ends meet, and also allows stability for renters to be able to plan, and landlords too.
As for the two options, either the city council having the authority to enact rent control through the ordinance process, or the voting base having the authority to do so through the petition process, are you ever both? Do you prefer one to the other? How do you feel about those two choices?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't really matter how I feel, because the mayor vetoed the citizen initiative and referendum version.
Yes.
I mean, I would prefer that they were both on the ballot, but they are not. So the policy version means that the council can enact an ordinance, and it may have to go to voters again, but it sort of depends on how things play out legally.
But it's not something that you feel that the resident side is an option the city ought to have? Say if residents in a specific ward feel their council member is failing them by not voting for a specific policy ordinance, is that something that you'd like to bring back as a charter amendment again, or willing to see what happens with the council? Should that be approved?
I think, we're willing to see what happens with the council version. It's unclear how everything's going to play out. We have an election, a set of new council members probably, and so I think there's a lot of variables at play. I think having the citizen initiative and referendum version gives options to community when council doesn't fulfill their promises, which, as someone who's worked on policy for a while, it would be nice to have the option. But, here we are, and we will do what we can with what we have in front of us.
Thank you for answering my questions. I don't know if we laid that out at the top, but clearly starting with Jennifer, then going to talk to Cecil a little bit, and then we'll have them both just in an open conversation at the end. So switching over to you now, Cecil. Firstly, do you think that rent control is something that is like a basic regulatory necessity, something relative to, as Jennifer said, the minimum wage? What does your organization think upon hearing something like that?
Sure. Well, first, let me thank the Plymouth Congregational Church for having us here tonight, to be engaging in a robust conversation about the Charter Amendment, and to everybody who's joining us online. We're glad you're with us, so we can engage as a community in these conversations, especially one that's centered around housing affordability, because I think it's really important that we draw attention to housing affordability and solutions that are going to work. So to answer your question, I don't believe that rent control is a functional policy. In fact, historically, peer-reviewed journal articles, the evidence of cities and municipalities that have tried it across the country show that it's a failed policy. Most price control systems are failed policies, and rent control is one of the best examples where price control economics create market distortions And that's what we see in other communities where rent control ends up limiting supply and causes a deterioration in the quality of housing. So housing affordability is definitely the challenge. I think there's many other factors than just rent that are contributing to that challenge. We don't talk enough about wage stagnation. I'm actually hoping that during this post-COVID period, we're really starting to see some movement on that. Anybody who's trying to bring people on board, add them to their workforce is having to raise wages. We think that wage stagnation has contributed significantly to the cost burdens that Jennifer describes, which are real and felt in the community. But rent control is not the solution. What we need to do is build more housing, create more housing, incentivize the development of more housing that's going to be affordable, it's going to be accessible, and in fact, I've argued for a long time that we need a systems change in the production of housing. We finance and build housing the way we did almost 100 years ago. I was just even thinking about houses that I've watched built, and the only thing that's like prefabricated is the trusses. You know, everything else is built together on site. We haven't reformed those systems. The way we do project entitlement, where it goes through the planning process and the permitting process, laborious and intensive, very costly. So all of these systems are contributing to housing and affordability. But I look at that problem, and the solution is not rent control. The solution is, let's fix housing supply and housing access for people who want a place to live that they can afford. And I certainly agree, you know, rent control helps the existing renters. There is no doubt about that. You know, the economic studies in peer-reviewed journals pointed out that rent control serves the existing renter base. The future renters are the ones that are hurt the most. And to that extent, I do believe that, you know, rent control is a race equity issue. Because if you look at communities in San Francisco, where the communities that have been displaced through rent control have been the black and brown communities. The Mission District used to be a Latino community in San Francisco. It's no longer that. And we have rent control in San Francisco. So we think, yes, this is the problem. We're glad we're having this conversation, that we're engaging in this conversation as a community, but rent control doesn't work.
How bad is the problem, in your view, the housing situation in Minneapolis? Is it a full-blown crisis? Are there certain segments that you feel like, yes, these areas are hurting, but with some, you know, proper management, we can get, you know, the ship righted? How bad is the situation?
Yeah. So there's different perspectives on that question. If you're the renter who's struggling to pay rent that month, it doesn't matter what the market is. I have those renters. They come to me and say, it's going to be late this month. I'm like, fine. When do you think you're going to have it? So at a very personal, at a very microeconomic level, it's a huge challenge for that person. When I look at the broader market and how our market is characterized nationally, I've been in meetings where our market has been dismissed because there's no rent growth potential in Minneapolis. And we just got the CoStar data on the 20 largest metropolitan areas. Austin, 20% increase the first 6 months of this year. Sacramento, something similar. Minneapolis was last, 3%. So that's where the steady eddies. I've even seen that on a PowerPoint deck. This market is the steady eddy of of rent growth. We don't have the wild fluctuations of other markets, and I consider that a great community asset. That's local ownership that rents to occupancy. It means they want to keep all the units filled, versus national players who rent to vacancy, which means we'll push rents as far as we can, and we'll suffer some vacancy because of that. We have this great treasure, you know, and Greater MSP and Family Housing Fund have talked about that relative housing affordability. So we have a national problem, but relative housing affordability in this market is a real asset for attracting people to come to Minnesota. And we all know people who moved here from Chicago because they found Chicago completely unaffordable. So those are two different perspectives, right? You can take the 10,000-foot view and it looks better than most places. But if you talk to my renter who's struggling that month because their hours got cut or they missed some hours because of a family emergency, it's a real challenge.
So the steadiness of the market, or specifically rent growth that you mentioned, should rent control policy be enacted in Minneapolis, it would inadvertently spike that, or at least make it less steady? Is that what you're saying?
So, well, I think whatever the cap is would set the market. That tends to happen in other communities that have rent control, as the rent increases match the cap. Because owners and managers will look at whatever they can capture in terms of the market, and that's why the rent control sets the market, right? You've now dictated, well, this market can now absorb a 3% rent increase, or whatever it's determined to be. And that's across the board. So you competing property down the street, they're going to do 3%. This property's going to do 3%. That's what happens because you're making the market through regulatory overreach.
In your description of the kind of state of the housing market, that's kind of a bit of the eye of the beholder, and that's true in a sense. If, you know, in the eye of the person who it is not great, both and is a term that's used in one of the other ballot questions in public safety, where there's an approach to reject tearing the department down and keeping the department, and then adding some of the things that other people would like to suggest, a kind of both and approach. Is rent control something that can be sidled along other kinds of things that you would suggest for making the Minneapolis housing market run a little bit better?
I wouldn't. I would go back to my earlier point that we need all hands on deck effort to get housing production going at a much stronger level. I mean, so I served on the Governor's Housing Task Force 2 years ago. They came out with a set of recommendations, sadly, which the legislature hasn't really looked at closely. That report said we need to be producing 30,000 housing units a year in this state. And we barely reach half of that most years. And that's insufficient for what we need. And every year we don't reach those goals, there's a deficit that now exists that still has to be made up. And when you have, and this, going back to Econ 101, there's limited supply, prices rise. When there's abundant supply, prices stabilize. And so that's how where we need to focus, what we need to be working on, as we need a statewide housing policy that's going to motivate that with incentives, with directed resources. We toured, and I've been in Greater Minnesota this year. This is not just a metropolitan issue. We have housing needs everywhere. It's inhibiting economic growth and economic opportunity across our state because there isn't places for people to live that they can afford, or they're driving extraordinary distances. So, and we need a regional policy, not just Minneapolis and St. Paul or St. Louis Park trying their own things on this. We need a regional policy, like how are we going to distribute housing, create housing across the market. The Star Tribune did an excellent report this summer about how little land is zoned for multifamily housing in this metropolitan area. We need to open that up so that there's more opportunities where we can develop housing in communities where it's going to be needed, and we can do it cost effectively, because it's much more cost effective to build multifamily housing than single family homes, both as a green solution, as a solution at scale that's going to work and house people who are looking for an affordable place to live.
So you're saying the reason that rent has gone up for the segment of the housing population for whom have these issues, it's a supply side issue. It's primarily because
No,
it
contributes. Okay, so
is the
I
largest
mentioned other
contributing
things:
factor?
wage stagnation.
Sure.
I think economic opportunity, educational opportunity. There's many systems that interact with housing. Housing does not stand as alone. In many ways, housing, many of if housing is the patient, there's many diseases and symptoms that are being manifest in housing. And we can work on what housing can work on, which is supply. The alternative is to regulate it like rent control, which I think all the evidence in peer-reviewed, there's lots of studies, but in peer-reviewed economic journals say this doesn't work as a policy. And then we can start to address the other issues with other systems in our community, whether it's education, talking about wage justice, all these other components that we see manifest in housing and affordability. So I don't believe housing supply is the silver bullet. In fact, and I don't think there's a silver bullet that creates housing supply. It's many systems of government and the private sector working in partnership to solve these problems. But instead, we're having conversations around regulation, whether it's zoning reform or regulatory reform, rather than looking at the whole system that needs reform, even a revolution.
So the cause for a lot of the housing issues is a multifaceted issue. Solving it through supply isn't necessarily a silver bullet, but it's something that the housing side can do. How does rent control policy get in the way of building more homes?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what all the evidence shows, is that investors do not come. And if we're talking about, Minneapolis potentially mirroring what's on the ballot in St. Paul, then there is no incentive to create housing, because every other market that I've looked at has a period of time that exempts new development, because they look at it and say nobody will invest here because they're in a rent-controlled environment. There is no offset to interest rate risk. So, folks need to understand that we don't generally get 30-year mortgages in commercial real estate. We get 5, 7, 10-year mortgages. There is a HUD product that has 40 years, and it takes a year to close the loan, so most people don't do it, and only certain properties qualify for it. Those are loan terms. So the interest rate risk is much shorter term than the wonderful 30-year fixed rate mortgage for homeowners. And that's a challenge, because what if interest rate exposure 5, 7 years from now is much higher, but there's a 3% rent cap? St. Paul is looking at 11% property tax increase. That's what the proposed levy increase is. That will absorb almost all of a 3% rent cap if there was a 3% rent cap in St. Paul right now. But other costs are out of the control of property owners and managers, like utility costs, some of which is actually set by the city. Insurance. insurance is a very challenging product in the commercial real estate world, because unlike homeowners, where the Commerce Department regulates the insurance companies to protect and offer consumer protection to homeowners, the commercial market is much more robust and dynamic, and companies come into markets and they leave markets, and pricing adjustment on insurance is out of the control of property managers. So there's three factors that are some of the most expensive elements of running a property that are completely out of the control of the property owner. And if we even look at what's happening in St. Paul now, that would immediately put all the properties in St. Paul in a situation where they're going to whatever this rent control board looks like in St. Paul and saying, we've got no capacity to absorb these other increases because you just raised property taxes so much that we can't absorb wage increases that we're having to pay, insurance increases that we're having, and the utility rates that you just raised. And so we're going to process thousands of rental properties through a board every year. I mean, it's an unworkable solution. So again, we have a problem, but this is the wrong solution.
And repair costs, I suppose, would be
well, that's
that would be
right. So you were asking about development a moment ago, and what it impedes against development. When you have a rent cap that is unsustainable, the only way a property can operate is to shortchange on capital expenditures, large maintenance improvements, whether it's windows and roofs, and they get delayed because, well, we have these direct operating expenses like taxes and insurance and utility costs that we have to absorb immediately and pay those bills to keep the lights on for our residents. And so there's delays in energy upgrades and improvements to the bones of the building. And so you get a deterioration, which is another observed effect with rent control policies in other cities. And so, and people can tell the rent controlled units in those cities because of often the dilapidation that's occurred. And then you get the other, effect where renters who have maintained their occupancy in a rent-controlled unit for a long time, and that's another effect of rent control, is there's a lack of mobility, housing mobility, that they end up having to fix up their own units. And this is an observed phenomenon in New York, where renters who have stayed in rent-controlled units and their incomes have increased over time, but the owner has no capacity to improve the property. The renters end up doing the improvements themselves in their own units. That is not the solution that we need in our community. Because again, that favors upper income renters against lower income renters who can't afford those kinds of things. It creates a different kind of disparity, which I don't want to see come to our community.
I'm going to now initiate the conversation between the two of you. I invite you two to speak directly to one another. I'll step in with questions here or there, but the idea that the 3% cap, Jennifer, that as he was discussing is kind of unworkably tight. How do you respond to that? Is that a number you'd be willing to move on?
Well, I think I want to first address specifically the reasons that make it a problem that Cecil was talking about. So I want to address first this comment about how rent stabilization policies limit the supply in the market. And I just want to name that the policies that we're talking about would allow a developer to set the price once a new unit is built. And so although, I would say the studies actually are mixed. Cecil said that they're not. All the studies show that supply goes down when policies like this are impacted. I actually found in looking at them that they were mixed. And it really depended on what other factors the studies looked at, right? Because and really traced whether or not development happened to other factors beyond rent stabilization policies. Because, like I said, developers are able to set the rents when they build a building. And so they can start out at a place where they know that it will work. So I just wanted to address that first of all. And specifically, I'm looking at a research done by UCLA in 2018. They produced a report that looked at a bunch of different studies of rent stabilization in the real world, not just the supply-demand version of a study. And then the second thing I want to address specifically is deterioration in housing, because I work with tenants all the time who experience deterioration in housing, who make repairs themselves because of that experience. And really the studies also show that what rent stabilization policies give renters is some protection when they ask for those repairs. Because right now, and I know this from experience, when people ask for repairs, eviction is not a surprise for some renters, right? Some landlords have a policy, basically, it's not written down, where folks who ask for repairs, it's found a way to get them out. And so a rent stabilization policy gives folks extra protection. It balances this really massive imbalance that there are between landlords and tenants in power. Because we're talking on one hand, somebody's ability to live somewhere versus another person's ability to make money. And then I just want to, address the specifics. I don't know, I'm not here doing the math on what it means to have 11% property tax increase and utilities and all these things. But I do know that Cecil previously in naming all these problems was speaking in broad generalities that I don't think the research actually backs up. And I also want you all to keep in mind that, like Solomon said at the beginning of this conversation, rent control policies have a long history in this country, and they've been implemented in very different ways. The early rent control policies in New York City were rent caps. And so how things look in those units is very different than the way that rent stabilization is implemented now. The way that rent stabilization is implemented now is always with a % increase that is allowed every year. And that makes for a different looking market than New York City. And so there is a lot more flexibility with these policies. And I believe that this is still the right way to go.
Well, look, we can argue about studies. What I've observed in recent years is that there are reports and studies that are put out, and they seem to serve a conclusion that they have in mind. I came from academia a long time ago, and I believe in peer-reviewed research. And whether it's the American Economic Review, which in 2019 talked about how San Francisco has suffered with a reduction of 15% in housing supply, because it's peer-reviewed. The statistics, the data, all has to be there for other academicians to examine and before it reaches publication. So whether it's that or talking to economists, where the University of Chicago went to the leading economic schools across the country, and these are not conservative economic schools. This is Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, Chicago, and 41 out of 42 economists said it doesn't have a positive impact. Rent control doesn't have a positive impact. So that's the academics of it. I'm a practitioner as well as representing an industry, and we can look at the operations, and we can look at the inherent risk in running a building where you're trying to provide housing and manage all the different costs and expense that are happening at that property. And when you have a fixed rent cap like this that creates an environment where people are not going to come into that market and build housing. And from the last census, we saw the addition of nearly 50,000 people in Minneapolis. We need to keep building housing in Minneapolis to continue to grow and to add people. And then that supports school districts and transit and walkable neighborhoods and all the things that we enjoy about living in the urban environment. So that's why I'm strongly resisting rent control, because I think it will break our housing market. And it's not an experiment that we should enter into. There is too much at risk and there's too much evidence. I mean, I just ask, show me a city where it worked. Like, even when people talk about San Francisco, it works in San Francisco. It's the most expensive city to live in America. So show me a city where rent control has worked well, where there's plenty of housing supply and housing affordability for people coming into the market. There may be affordability for those in the rent control units, but that doesn't serve the greater good and the greater growth of the community.
Would you say, Jennifer, that there are not success stories for rent control, other places that people can maybe look at to as an example? And if not, is there a path forward for the city or city officials to cobble together a policy that would work, in your eyes?
I think I want to address first the San Francisco question, which I think, you can't look at California housing without talking about the tech industry and the impact of the tech industry on the housing in California. So I think you have to look at it holistically and not just at the rent stabilization policies as the culprit for what's happened in the housing market. I think from allies in New York City, there's places that, an eviction in New York City, I was talking to folks a couple months ago, an eviction in New York City can take up to a year. I mean, is like normal if it takes a year. Whereas right now, in our city, you can be kicked out of your home in 10 days with an eviction process. Sorry, in 12 days when the eviction moratorium is ended. So I think the strength of the renter movement, including the different versions of rent stabilization and rent control policies that have been enacted in New York City, have materially benefited the renters who live there. There are places in New Jersey where there's been rent stabilization for a long time, where you can see the benefits. And all the studies show over and over again that rent stabilization keeps people in their homes. And that's really what we're talking about. Like Cecil said, housing isn't being built at the amount that it should be built at. And if we were to go with that strategy, we're going to be waiting for years. And in that time, our people of color and immigrant neighbors are going to be gone. Who is Minneapolis going to be for as a city, right? I want my neighbors to stay in their homes, and that's really what this is about. And that doesn't mean that we don't implement other strategies. I think we do. We go after everything that we can go after, including investment. But when I think of transformation in housing, I think of investment in things like public housing and different versions of affordable housing that are actually permanent instead of the situation that we have now.
To wrap up the last couple of minutes, are there specific kind of alternatives, just ideas that you might have to rent control? I mean, you said kind of generally housing, building more housing and having, state law and other kind of laws in place to provide incentives. Are there other kinds of things that, other than rent control, that you believe is a better way to help people who might be suffering with high rents?
Yeah, look, let me just say, I want to keep my neighbors housed, and certainly I'll concede rent control is going to keep them housed, but I want my neighbors' kids to have a place to live too, once they're ready to have their own place. And that's the concern, that's the long-term concern, the long view that I have in mind here. So I think we need to keep that question, that concern, the other renters, the people that don't have a voice in this election, they're not voting because they're 18 years away maybe from needing a place to rent. and I want to make sure that they have a place to rent. So, look, there's one of the missing ingredients right now is leadership on housing policy. We don't have leadership at the national level. We don't have leadership at the state level. We tried to have leadership over the last 4 years in Minneapolis on affordable housing. I sat in this room at a mayoral forum 4 years ago, and everybody was talking about housing policy and housing affordability. And here we are 4 years later, we're having the same conversation, but this time it's about rent control. That's the missing ingredient. We need champions. We need elected officials who are champions of this to bring stakeholders together to find constructive solutions between the public and private sectors, so we can get solutions at scale that are going to work for our community. And that's what I'm looking for.
That'll do it for the three of us here. Thank you, Jennifer and Cecil, for answering my questions.
Thank you, Solomon.
I
Thank you,
appreciate
Jennifer.
Well, I will add my thanks. Thank you so much to Solomon and to Jennifer and Cecil. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in to listen. We will be sharing this recording, and I hope that it gets shared widely and broadly after it's posted on the Plymouth Congregational Church website. We will have two additional programs that discuss upcoming, that are discussing the other two amendments on Minneapolis ballot. So on October 7th, we will have a discussion about the public safety ballot measure, and then on the 14th of October, discussion of government structure. So hope you tune in for that, and again, thank you so much.
Thank you.